Hey there, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well. My name is Matt, and I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for choosing to spend a little bit of your time today with us. Again, welcome, happy holidays. And let me just say too, on behalf of NeoSystems and Michael, that we hope everybody's remaining safe and healthy. Certainly some challenging times we're in, but truly our hope is that everybody on the call today is doing well. Again, thanks for joining. You're going to hear a discussion around sort of best practice when it comes to financial planning and budgeting. And our session topic today is 4 keys for constructing a just right budget. And sort of the subtext to that is whether or not in your planning process, you might consider yourselves either too aggressive or perhaps too cautious and conservative. And so with that, we'll move forward. And Michael and I will do the conversation today. At the end, we'll have time for questions, but we'll start by better introducing ourselves. And then I will give just a tidbit of context of who NeoSystems is, certainly not as a sales approach here, but more in terms of just setting context of who we are and just where we come from. And when we talk, just again, sort of the backdrop of that conversation and what we see in the marketplace. I'll turn things over to Michael. He'll do the heavy lift here, as he usually does. He'll get into the conversation, starting with the approach that many people take and kind of opening up dialogue around the session subtitle of whether or not you consider yourselves fairly aggressive or fairly conservative in the budgeting approach and budgeting cycle. And then dialogue sort of drilling down into, well, how do you find that just right or sweet spot, if you will? And then perhaps Mike will give us some counsel around ways or keys for constructing what we call that just right budget. And then he and I will probably kind of tag team when you consider the process. We'll start to talk about some trends in the marketplace that we're seeing today as an integrator that serves by and large the government contracting community or project-oriented businesses, and seeing a shift from what we call static planning to that more of an active planning thesis. Michael will then talk a little bit more about systems requirements and good counsel around your platform or foundation for actually maybe more automating a budget, getting away from spreadsheets. And then as we are practitioners of everything that we represent in the market, and we're purposeful in the way that we go to market, we'll touch lightly on a tool set that we use from Workday. And then hopefully we'll leave time for some online questions and answers here. So that's our agenda. Again, welcome. And let me just better introduce ourselves. I'll have Michael go first. And we're just pleased to have Michael here because not only is he a CEO and giving guidance around obviously our budget process as a company, but has a CPA and former CFO. So he brings a lens of what maybe a controller or CFO would consider in terms of a budget. Michael?
Thank you, Matt. And thanks everybody for attending today too. And like Matt, I hope everybody is safe and healthy and excited about the holidays coming up. In terms of my background, as Matt just said, Michael Tinsley, I'm the president and CEO of NeoSystems and one of the 2 co-founders. But from a background perspective, I have a finance and accounting background. I started my career with PwC and was an auditor there for 4 years or so. And then from there, moved into industry. And as I did that, I advanced from being an accounting manager up to VP of Finance and eventually a CFO. And all of those positions were really within the government contracting industry. And then in 2003, decided to start NeoSystems together with my partner, Rob Wilson. The idea being that we could take our collective experience and begin offering services, which I think Matt will talk about a little bit later, that might be a benefit to the government contracting community since that's where we spend most of our time. So let me pause there, Matt, and maybe you can give us some background on yourself.
Yeah, just quickly, we'll get into the meat of the conversation. So I'm Matt. I head up sales and marketing for our organization, but I haven't always been an opportunity-facing person. My background's actually similar to Michael in that I rose to the ranks in the accounting and finance field, becoming a CFO of a 8A government contractor. Before I went to work for my first technology company way back in 1996, unlike Michael, I wasn't a very good accountant, and I just more gravitated towards anything opportunity facing. So even though I have a master's in government contracting, I like to think I can talk the talk, but not to dive too deep. Anyway, on the next slide, just to set context, Michael and I, as Michael talked about, he founded NeoSystems. In context of why we're talking today, we're just this great company headquartered in Tysons Corner, Virginia. 4 main lines of business. The heart of who we are, we're a systems integrator. So traditionally in that makeup, we would partner with a very select and purposeful set of applications that are pretty well known in the GovCon project-oriented world, whether that be a Deltek solution, a Workday solution, Concur, Integrify, which is a business process flow and workflow automation tool, et cetera. So we have some resale rights within that. We go out and implement solutions, standing folks up successfully on those solutions. In that regard, we do integrations, extensibilities, web services. We also do full-blown outsourced managed services, accounting, IT, and HR. So in some instances, companies just look to us to more or less run their administrative functions for them. We also have our own cloud. Several hundred clients choose to host their typical back office applications in our cloud, thanks to regulatory and compliance issues such as SOC 1, SOC 2, ITAR, FISMA, FISMA ready, FISMA moderate. From a FedRAMP perspective, you'll find this on the GSA schedule. And then our last line of business is all about keeping data secure and managed security services, outsourced managed security services, including a whole discipline of how we educate primes and subs around CMMC, kind of hot in the market today. Anyway, to move forward, that's us as an organization. And I think at this time, Michael, I'll just go ahead and hand off to you.
Okay, great. Thanks again, Matt. So as we go through the slide deck today, you're probably going to hear me referring to Don. Please change the slide. And so there's a man behind the curtain. Don Carnival is one of our marketing executives, and he's helping us stay on track today. But as we do move through the deck, we're not only going to be discussing the budget and the idea of being aggressive or conservative as it relates to that, but also the budgeting process and the tools that you might use to prepare your budget. And that concept of being aggressive or conservative is actually relevant to those elements of the budget as well. So we'll talk about those. And really what we're going to be sharing today is a lot about our own journey, if you will. Because I think by sharing that, it might be helpful to people attending today. When I think back to when we first started the company, just myself and Rob Wilson, it was just us. And to the degree that we had a budget, it was really on the back of an envelope. And I think a lot of companies probably start that way. But if you fast forward through the years and we progressed, now I have a board of directors that I have to answer to, and they can be pretty challenging at times. I have a bank that I have to deal with and covenant ratios that I have to report. So they certainly have an interest in a budget. And I have investors that I have to deal with. So, going back from where we started to where we are now, a budget and a budget process and a budget tool have become really important. And that's probably going to be relevant to a number of you on the call today. So I just wanted to share a little bit about our journey. You'll also hear me talk, and actually Matt used the term already, the idea of active planning, and that's emerged over the years as a best practice, and we certainly adopted that at NeoSystems. And Matt and I will sort of do a tag team because he's certainly one of the participants in our budgeting process, and he can give you some perspectives about being a participant, an active participant in that process as we go along. But throughout the conversation, you'll see that this idea of being aggressive or conservative is something we'll weave throughout because it is relevant to every aspect of a budget. So Don, if you would go forward to the next slide. So again, we're going to start with the discussion around whether you're going to be aggressive or conservative and how you approach your budget. And in this particular slide, or to start off with, we're really thinking about how you might form your budget targets. How much revenue are you going to go after? Is it going to be a 10% growth or a 30% growth or a 50% growth in terms of being aggressive about that or conservative. But as you think about that, you do need to realize that your posture as you go into that effort is going to have an effect on your company. Is the way you approach the budget and the targets that you put forward something that's going to encourage engagement across your company, or is it going to be something that creates conflict? So for an example of that, if you're targeting an 80% growth, that's a pretty aggressive growth, and people are going to feel a fair amount of pressure. That may be well what you want to do, and there may be reasons for that, but that's probably also going to create a little bit of conflict within your company because everybody's going to feel a lot of that pressure. So not one decision is more right than the other, but you do need to think about the impact that kind of might have on your company as you go about creating and implementing a budgeting process. You also want to think about how you're going to go about measuring performance against the budget after you get the budget created. And that's really not a small thing to overlook either, because again, as you implement a budgeting process, if you have not had one previously, then that's going to be an element of change for your workforce. And if you're a government contractor, of course, you have to consider how DCAA is going to respond to your budget. So that's a unique requirement of the GovCon community, and we'll talk quite a bit to that as we go through the rest of the slide deck. So Don, if you'll go forward. So when you think about that conservative versus aggressive, you really want to find the sweet spot for your company. And that sweet spot is quite frankly going to be different from one company to the next. So we're not here today to actually tell you what the sweet spot is for you, but we do want you to hone in on that and realize that you know, you need to consider all the different aspects of how you go about your budgeting process, including how it's going to affect your company. So Don, if you go forward to the next slide here, again, here we're talking about the aggressive, conservative kind of thing. If you are, and you need to consider the impacts of that. If you're too aggressive, you know, what are the possible negative aspects of that? Because again, your investors may be reacting to that. They may certainly like the aggressive projections that you put forward in your budget. But if you begin to miss them, you know, they're not going to be so happy with that. Same thing with your bank. They may react great to a budget that has a lot of growth included in it. But if you do start performing against it and come up short, then that's going to be an issue for them. On the other side of the coin, though, if you're too conservative, your folks within your operations may love that because it'll be easier for them to achieve the results. But the risk there is that you're actually going to underachieve. You may not have achieved what you're actually capable of just because the budget didn't push people to do that. And then for those in the government contracting community, there's an added risk, whether you're aggressive or conservative, in the sense that your budget is going to be supporting your provisional indirect rates. And if you underrun those rates, then you may find yourself in a position of giving money back to the government. And if you overrun the rates, then that's going to create a situation where it either eats into your profit or it's going to eat into the contract funding if you attempt to pass that added cost on to your customer. So again, that's something to consider as you decide what posture you're going to have going into your budget. Don, if we go to the next slide, we do want to talk about the 4 keys of sort of helping you find the just right budget or your sweet spot. So Don, if you go to the next slide, you actually want to start the budgeting process by looking back in order to look ahead. And so what we mean by that is, you know, if you've had some degree of budgeting in the past, what has been your experience? Do you find that you've been too aggressive and you've continually missed your budgets? If so, that would be something you want to consider in how you form the budget targets going forward. On the other hand, if you've been pretty conservative and you've always exceeded your budgets or met them, then that might be an indication that you're probably being too conservative. So again, do look back in order to look forward to help inform yourselves as to how you should approach your budget. And another thing to consider, one of the other keys, is trying to identify who is going to be the primary users of your budget. And it may in fact be that it's all three of the parties that I have listed here, but it may be true that one is more primary for you than others. So your operational staff may use the budget, they probably will, because it's going to help them manage their performance as they go through the year. If you have a board of directors, certainly they're going to have some use of the budget, and the bank and the investors that you deal with are certainly going to have an interest in your budget. But consider those different user populations and how you need to position your budget in order to meet what their expectations might be. The third thing you want to consider is really assessing your level of risk. If you don't achieve your budget, what impact would that likely to have on your organization? That's just something to consider as you go about setting your targets. And also, in light of all of that, you might even consider whether you want to have multiple versions of your budget. Not every company does this. Some companies do. I have done it in the past myself, where I might make an aggressive budget for internal management purposes so that I can push my managers to achieve high targets. And then I have another version of the budget that I might share with my bank or my investors that might be a little more conservative. That is certainly more work. It does put more pressure on your budgeting tool and on your budgeting process, but it can be a useful way to approach your budget. Another thing to consider is performing quarterly refreshes, at least quarterly. Some folks will call that a quarterly forecast. But you want to do that so that you're continually reassessing the elements of risk within your company so that you're putting forward a plan or a forecast that is consistent with the risk and your past results for that matter, so that it's continually made more relevant as you go through the year. And regardless of what ends up being just right for you, there are certain things that you want your budget to help you to achieve. And first among them is, again, using it to motivate your team so that they can use it to manage their processes as they go about managing their business in order to meet your budget. You also want to make sure that the budget reflects that you are investing your resources, if you will, amongst your highest priorities, your highest business initiatives. So if there's a particular line of business that you think is going to be the fastest growing or have the most profit or whatever might be the case, then you want to make sure that you're pointing your resources predominantly in that direction. And then again, you want to protect your company as best you can if unforeseen challenges come up. And that's really where that quarterly refresh comes into play that I was speaking about, together with doing some ongoing analysis, your budget to actual variances. That's important so you can help keep your company on track. And Matt, I don't know if you've had any observations that you'd like to share here, but let me see if you have anything to add.
Well, I always have something to add. So it'd be odd for anybody to hear somebody say somebody actually enjoys a budgeting process, but I actually do. As a former accountant, and I'm old, so this goes back a long way, but I did not enjoy the budget cycle or process. But as an executive in a company today and somebody who's not in the accounting department, but as a consumer of the budget, I appreciate the way we go about things. So we're not on, our company's not unlike any other company that a wide swath of folks maybe get together and think about what are your big bets for next year and where should your focus be. And we develop as a group charters, that's what we call them. And those charters, as Michael talked about here, would typically take the lion's share of investment, and we see those as the highest priority business initiatives. But we involve a lot of folks because there's so much data these days that we find that no one of us can consume all of that data. So we want input. And so we do find that input motivates employees. It provides a great level of transparency and almost this feeling of ownership that when I then go back to talk to my staff about budgets on a regular basis, they're informed. And certainly Michael's on the phone and he's my boss and he gives very strong guidance from a top down, but we are influenced by that bottoms up approach. And, thankfully the tool set that we use, which we'll talk a little bit about here shortly, affords that input in more active planning that that we've talked about or we'll talk about further. So not much more than that, Michael, other than just agreeing with you that, the right process, the right involvement by others in the organization outside of finance can be pretty impactful in a positive way for the budgeting process.
Great, thanks, Matt. Thanks for sharing that. I do think it's important for folks to get sort of multiple points of view on how to go about their budget. So Don, if you go to the next slide. So budgets don't just happen on their own. There's certainly a budget process that you need to consider and put in place for your company. And you also need to give some consideration to what tools you're going to use in order to prepare your budget and support using it going forward. So we're going to talk about that a little bit too. So Don, if you go to the next slide. What we're talking about here, again, you've heard Matt and I sort of use the reference to active planning. And that's an important sort of best practice that has developed across the years. Here we're comparing that to what we refer to as static planning. And to be honest, that's where most companies start. When I think back on our history, that's in fact where I started. Because again, when we did our first budget, it was simply me doing it. And so I didn't have anybody else involved. It was certainly a top-down budget. So it was limited in the sense that I really didn't get down to the account level. So there was nothing that could really be used from an operational or transactional point of view to help us stay on the budget. And then it was just slow in terms of getting the budget actually prepared. And I usually only did that on an annual basis because it was just one of the other things that have to get added to your plate. And I don't think that our history is atypical. I think most companies go through this phase where if there is a budget in place, it's again being done from a top-down approach where one person is primarily involved. And we sort of look at that and call that static planning. But if you compare that, Don, if you go to the next slide, to the concept of active planning, where it really does become a collaborative process across multiple people within your organization and certainly cross-functional, meaning finance is involved, the various departments of your operational efforts are involved, your facility management is involved, sales is involved. It's really important, I think, to get all of those folks involved in the process. And as a part of doing that, you want to be more comprehensive. And in terms of doing that, you want to make sure that you're developing your budget really at a detailed level. And for me, that means down at the account level. Now, that certainly doesn't preclude you. And in fact, you would roll it up to a higher level because some users of the budget, for example, your board of directors, probably will not want to get down to the account level. So you need the ability to roll it up and let those who need to look at it at a high level do so. But it's also important to be doing it down at the detail level because it really does play an important role. If you look over on the right side of the screen, the continuous monitoring there, because you do want to be on a monthly basis doing what I call your actual to budget comparisons, and you might hear a term called ABC reporting, actual to budget comparison. So you want to do that at least on a monthly basis. And you might want to do quarterly forecasting, as we alluded to earlier, so that you continually have a way to focus on your results and put forward a refreshed plan, if you will, in the form of a forecast that would be more informed by what's gone on within your results so far and what you're facing in the market or within your operations now. And Matt, I know you just alluded to being involved in that active process. So you might have comments you want to make here as well.
Yeah, not to sound repetitive, but in my role, I do talk to a whole lot of clients and prospects on a daily basis, and we are hearing, like we've done as an organization, a shift from more of a static planning thesis to more of an active planning model to get away from that small group of folks that used to be considered sort of paternalistic, as the term you used, to more of a the ability to have across functional visibility into what might be oftentimes complex operations. So, the old way of doing things really we saw or here would favor sort of instinct over data, and data is very important today. That would often create just workarounds or shadow planning, which is not healthy. So the active planning that we hear that from us and from our prospects and clients really does empower teams. It brings people who are into the process, who are likely the closest to the day-to-day operations. Certainly that participation gives more detail behind it, getting folks away from spreadsheets. And then again, to me, the most important thing is that this is just so highly transparent and accessible. As a sales leader, again, I try to get away from my accounting life, but I do find this so easy, in part thanks to the tool set that we have and the active planning process, that I like the accessibility. So I can, hold informed conversations with my team, and then I can report to Michael, how we're doing, if not on a monthly basis, even more frequent than that. So the shift from active to planning in the tool set we use is quite consumable and frankly pretty easy. And we've been more informed that way to identify problems before they become problematic, and stay healthy and more competitive, and all the good stuff that you would deem would naturally come out of that.
Thanks, Matt. And Don, if you want to go to the next slide. So in addition to sort of coming up with the just right budget for you, that's been done in consideration of how aggressive or conservative you might want to be, or what's been your historical experience with working with budgets. Just realize that this active planning that we're talking about is going to involve quite a number of people across your company. And as you do that, you need to pause to sort of consider what their experience level might be. And you want to look at certainly folks within your finance organization, accounting organization, but even your operational staff. So on the finance side, you're going to want your budget again to be able to support your provisional rates. And that means your financial model is going to have to incorporate all of the rigors of how rates are established and calculated within your accounting system, and have those be reflected within your budget. So considering the experience level of your finance organization is important, but also your operational staff, because they're going to be managing their business in relation to the budget that you have formed together with them. And you might have some program managers or project managers that are great at developing software, but maybe they don't have experience with actually managing to a budget. So that sounds elementary, but I've seen that be the case in many instances. So think about your folks who are involved in operations, who are going to be running, managing their business to meet your budgeting goals, and see how sophisticated they might be or experienced they might be in terms of managing against a budget. And even think about, can both your accounting staff and your operational staff use your tool set? Because as they get to the point of trying to do these actual to budget comparisons, they're going to need to do things like drill down into your account activity so they can figure out why rent is too high or indirect labor is running higher than they thought it should be. So that's all a part of running a successful budgeting process. And as you think about how to evaluate where your resources stand within that, consider whether or not some training might be advisable. It might be a good idea for you to invest in training, either around the tool that you select, or even in a more broad sense about how to use budgets to help you manage your work. So again, that's something to consider. So Don, if you go forward one more slide, getting back to my thing that good budgets don't just happen. Everybody needs to have some sort of a budgeting tool in place, or a platform, that I use that term here, to help them through the process of creating their budgets, getting various people involved, and then using it to help manage their company going forward. So Don, if you go forward to the next slide. When you're determining what tool you want to use to support your budgeting effort, you want to look at, well, what do you want the tool to do? That's the first question, to be honest. And really the budget itself is, at least for a government contracting firm, is sort of the tip of the iceberg. And on this particular slide, you'll see that I'm using two color fonts, and I'm doing that on purpose. And I'm trying to differentiate here against some of the concerns that you might have as a government contractor that some of your commercial peers might not have. Certainly, every company needs a budget. They probably have a board of directors. They probably have a bank. They probably, that they deal with, they may want to create goals. They certainly have key performance indicators. And they will probably have a need for quarterly forecasting. So you would want a system certainly that would enable you to do all those things. But if you're a government contracting firm, you have other considerations to make. And one among them is your budget is going to need to support your provisional rate calculation, your fringe overhead and G&A rates. And your company may have even a more complex indirect rate structure than that. So your budgeting model is going to need to support that kind of calculation. And not every product on the market does that. So you need to pay attention to whether the tool that you might be considering will in fact support that. And will it also enable you to do that rate variances? Because trying to meet your indirect rates is a large part of the game within the government contracting industry. So don't forget about that. You also may well want a platform that's going to also serve as a project management tool. So rather than having multiple tools, there are systems on the market that can do more things than once, walk and chew gum at the same time, so to speak. So there are systems out there that can also perform a project management, support a project management activity, such things as tracking your project spend rate or your burn rate, some people call them. It can enable project reporting that your project managers might need to make to report upstream within your company, or even reporting to the customer themselves. And you might also want a system that embeds a resource management aspect. Do I have pockets of available time across my organization? Or have I booked so much work that, I really need to kickstart my recruiting activity, or I'm not going to have any chance of performing this work that I've already booked. So having a system that also has a resource management capability associated with it would likely be an important consideration too. Another common use of a system like this for government contractors is to use the same system that you might be using for budgeting purposes to support your proposal pricing activities. And that's quite important because when you put together a proposal, you're likely going to be using your provisional rates, and your provisional rates are going to be calculated within your budget. So having a pricing model that is interactive with your provisional rate calculation is a good thing. And likewise, as I just spoke about resource management, if you are doing proposal pricing within this tool and you want to draw from your resource pool, then again, that gives you a way to project into the future what your recruiting needs might be if you're overutilized, or if you're underutilized, what kind of a course correction you might want to do. And then again, if you're using the same system to do your proposal pricing as you are using your budget, then once that project is awarded, then you can more quickly convert that pricing schema that you did into a budget that you could then use to manage that project. So again, those are many different aspects of a budgeting and forecasting tool that's sort of over and above what some folks might think of just when they use the term budgets. So I wanted to point that out to the audience too, since I think we're probably talking predominantly to government contractors here today. So Don, if you go to the next slide. So as you're making those considerations, what platform is best for you? So you certainly do want to understand the requirements. Think about all those things that we just talked through in the previous slide. Many of them are listed here again on this slide. But you want to make sure that you're doing research so that you find the best tool for you. And in terms of our own journey, we certainly did a lot of research. I talked to a number of my colleagues within the industry to see what tools they might be using. I also did market research. I relied heavily upon the Gartner tool to see what budgeting systems they were tracking within their Magic Quadrant. I found that to be a good source of information. And then once I made an initial cut of vendors, I invited them all in to give me demos. So be prepared to work through that process too, because all of that is important as you go through the process of identifying which platform might be best for you. So Don, if we go to the next slide, once you have alighted upon what tool you think is best for you, in light of the multiple possible uses for that budgeting solution, and again, I would encourage you to look for a solution that might enable you to do all of those things that we just talked about on a previous slide. You know, the budgets themselves, yes, but something you can use as a project management tool, something you can use as a resource management tool. Try to find a system. I think it's wise to try and find a system that will be able to do all of those things. But once you make that decision, this idea of being aggressive or conservative comes back into play, because you're talking about a fairly heavy lift there in terms of implementing a budgeting system that would allow you to do all of those things. So while you want to select a tool, I believe, that does have all of those capabilities, you might want to roll that out in phases so that you're not overwhelming either your operational teams or your finance and accounting teams. And so you might start with just what we refer to as the organizational budgets, which would be your company-wide budget that might create your provisional rates. Conversely, you might have such a need for a project management tool that you want to start there. Do that first, rather than doing the organizational budget. And I mentioned proposal pricing. Maybe you will layer that on top after you've gotten the other two accomplished, and then expand it into a resource management capability. The path that you put forward for your company will, of course, depend upon your own considerations. What's right for you after you consider all of those things that we talked about. But if you make the right selection, your budgeting platform will probably allow for you to implement it first doing one of the functions that you selected. And then as you go through using it and get some experience with it, expand the use of that tool into these other areas. If you're very aggressive, you might do all of these at once. And there are certainly some clients that we work with that in fact do that. But it's also common for companies to take a phased approach, just so they're not overwhelmed as they go about implementing a comprehensive budgeting system for their first time. Don, if you go forward to the next slide, Matt, I think I'll turn it over to you here, because we've gone through that process again in our own journey, and we've made our own selection, and we think we've selected a tool that's good and relevant for the government contracting community. But Matt, maybe you could talk a little more about that.
Yeah, Don, let's go to the next slide. And I'm not going to dwell on this. I don't want this to come across as a sales pitch, but being the sales guy that I am, I'll just in context speak about this. But I'll say this first. Thanks, Michael. For those that don't know Michael, maybe can tell that Michael's very methodical in his approach to anything, and quite conservative when it came to implementing a new tool set with financial planning and budgeting implications. And knowing that as an integrator and serving thousands of government contractors, there were some known commodities in terms of tool sets in the market. And it should be said that we moved as a company and made a transformation from a budgeting tool that was embedded in the back office ERP system to one that we consider more best in class. And again, Michael took a conservative approach, an exhaustive approach to understanding what tool sets were in the market, which would afford a government contractor, I think, the best means to budget. And so that would mean, this active planning thesis, end user friendliness and consumability, scalability, inclusiveness, collaboration, everything we just talked about, but at the same time doing everything that a government contractor finds that their day-to-day minutia mandates, and at the same time speaking to compliance. So we did land on a Workday product called Adaptive. We think it's a phenomenal tool. Even a non-technical person like me can go into the tool and use it quite easily and robustly to the point where I can report up to Michael some very common sensical information and sound like I know what I'm talking about. So we think highly of the tool set. Obviously, you can read faster than I can speak, but from calculating nested and cost allocations with indirect rates, departmental budgets, project models, org models, the project status and utilization reporting that is dear to a government contractor's heart, resource management, it does all of that. And so as an integrator too, I said, we're very selective and purposeful of the companies we partner with. And it's a great relationship and a great tool. So if you do have a need for a new tool set, we'd love to talk to you. We have resale rights within this partnership, and we have a full bench of practitioners that can implement the tool set and get you up and running to take ownership of it and be successful. And it does have bisynchronous integration to certain ERP companies such as Deltek CostPoint, which might be pretty popular to some of you. So that's been, that heavy lift has been taken off the shoulders, but great tool set, does what a government contractor needs it to do. And the end user friendliness and scalability of it is just second to none. And we should have said too, we're practitioners of everything we represent in the market. Yeah, Michael led us through this transformation. It's worked out great. So a little bit of a sales pitch there, I guess, but in context,
Thanks,
it's a
Matt.
great tool set. Yep.
I just want to point out here too, regardless of which tool you might decide to use, there are certain elements on this screen that I want to hone in on because it'll be important to your own decision. And the first one there is the concept of what we called nested rates or nested allocations. That's sort of unique to government contracting companies because you probably have a situation where you're using service centers, and those service centers need to get allocated into different pools, your fringe, overhead, and G&A. And then your fringe has to get allocated into overhead and G&A, and then overhead gets then allocated into G&A. So all of that is what I refer to as nested allocations, where one allocation might actually become a portion of the base for the next allocation. And I found that not every budgeting product on the market actually supported the concept of nested allocations, much less the concept of calculating an indirect rate and pinpointing a rate-based variance. So again, that's something to consider as you're going through your own consideration as to which tool that might be used. And then going down to the lower half of the screen, if you're going to be using your tool for project manager purposes, and again, I would encourage that, make sure that it's going to be able to calculate utilization rates because that's going to be very important for you, that it's going to allow you to make go forward projections on your projects, and that it has the ability to create sort of placeholders for new projects that might not even be known at the time you're doing your budget. That's an important part of that too. And again, make sure it does have the ability to expand and be useful for you as a resource management tool. So sorry, Matt, I just wanted to add those sort of.
Oh, it's great color. Thanks, Michael.
Speaking out on the slide. So
very good. Thanks. We can go to the next slide. Then the next slide, Don. Michael, do you want to make a few? Well,
yeah,
we'll make a few summary comments. Then we do have time for a few questions and answers, and then we'll give our contact information. I should say, if anybody wants a copy of this deck, certainly just request it. But Michael, do you want to make a few closing statements?
Sure, I do. So as it shows on the screen here, that concept that we used to start off the presentation, and really we wove it throughout the presentation, because that idea of how aggressive or conservative you want to be as a company is really applicable to all the different elements of your budget, not only from how you set your targets, but how you're going to select a tool and how you going to go about implementing that tool. So do think about where you stand on that continuum or that scale in terms of how aggressive or conservative you might be as a company in light of your own circumstances. And again, not only think about the budget, but think about your budgeting process, because I found, as Matt has alluded to here, that was just as important as a budget tool itself, because you do want to engage others in your organization in the budgeting process so that you don't come upon a situation that I ran upon when I was first starting NeoSystems, where my managers didn't feel like it was their budget. Because if they missed the budget and I tried to hold them accountable, the first thing I would hear is, well, it's not my budget. I didn't prepare it. So you don't want to get into that sort of scenario with your workforce. And the best way to combat that or to address that is for this active planning concept that we have been referring to, getting your organizational managers involved in the process so that they end up owning the budget. It just makes it much easier for you as upper level management of the company to get them engaged and own up to trying to meet the budget targets that you set for them. And then again, do select the best budgeting platform for yourself in light of what your own objectives are, and then alight upon an implementation strategy, again, that fits your company in light of what you think your appetite might be for how quickly you could implement the various functions that a good budgeting platform is going to be able to support. So I'll stop there in terms of summary. And Matt, as you just mentioned, we're certainly open for answering any questions that anyone might want to pose at us.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And we don't have any open questions right now, but we do have a few more minutes. So if anybody wants to type in a question, we certainly would try to field that. Alternatively, we have some contact information for you. You could certainly reach out to us one-on-one. And Don, if you could go to the next slide where we have some contact information, either Michael or I would be happy to hear from you, or you can contact NeoSystems in general. Again, yes, Michael, thank you. Always great detail and leading us through a transformation that's worked out really well. So would love to hear from anybody who has questions. And again, if you'd like a copy of these slides, we'd be happy to get them out to you. And then, yeah, no questions. So we'll go ahead and end. But again, as I said at the top of the hour here, Michael and I and Don, and on behalf of Neo, hope everybody remains very safe and very healthy, and wish you a very happy holiday. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.